when you go to a memorial service or a funeral service, that you often learn things about the loved one who has passed, about the saints of the church that surprise you. So not too long ago, I was sitting at the luncheon after Jack Beck's memorial service and talking with some of the family, and I learned something that I didn't know about Jack. I learned that Jack had red hair. And that was not something that I knew. And it was a fun fact for me because I have always been a redhead. I know you're looking at me, but it's back here somewhere. If you look carefully, it's there still. Always have been a redhead, and clearly Jack was too. Even after he had this head of snowy white hair, he thought of himself as a redhead, and I learned that on his driver's license, in that spot where you're supposed to indicate what color of hair you have, on Jack's driver's license it said red hair. His whole life long. I think that Jack just always thought of himself as a redhead. He was sort of a redhead inside. There's a thing about being a redhead, and you just always feel like you're a redhead all your life. Jack had this sense, I think, that he was always that redheaded kid, full of energy and athletic ability, who was the luckiest kid in the world, deeply blessed by God. That's how he thought of himself. And you need to understand that Jack was raised in the Delaware County Children's Home. Jack's father was deceased, and the state took him away from his mother when he was only 2 years old because she couldn't afford to feed him. In Jack's words, he was basically starving to death. But Jack deeply appreciated the children's home. He said to me, there was a roof over my head and food in my belly, and I had 2 changes of clothes, and I never lacked for a child to play with. Now, I tell you, there are lots of people who in such circumstances might have been resentful. But there was nothing in Jack that was resentful about things. He was just one of those people who looked for the good and found it. I want to be like Jack. Anybody want to be like Jack? Yeah, I want to be like Jack, you bet. So the passage that we read from the scriptures today is a passage that calls us and suggests that we should be like Jack, that we should be people who are looking for the good. Now, I know we read this passage today, and it's sort of a hard passage to imagine that this is really all about hope, but that's what it's about. This is a passage that it is what we call the small apocalypse. It's part of the small apocalypse. And Matthew, Mark, and Luke all have these apocalyptic words of Jesus, all set in the same setting. Apparently, Jesus and his disciples, they were at the Temple Mount some few days before he would die, and some of those disciples who come from the countryside, they were looking at the temple and just in awe, just amazed at its grandeur and its beauty, and they were commenting on it. And it prompted Jesus to start talking about things that were yet to come. And one of those things that were yet to come was the destruction of the temple. So as we read these words, these apocalyptic words of Jesus, they sometimes sound a little bit confused, and there's a reason for that. Part of it is that by the time Luke wrote down these words, some of them had already come into being. So Jesus had talked about how Jerusalem would be attacked and the city would be surrounded by an army, and the temple would be destroyed. And those things had already happened in roughly 66 to 70 AD during the Jewish-Roman War. And by the time Luke wrote down these words, maybe 10 years, maybe 15 years after that, some of these things that Jesus had talked about had already taken place. And indeed, he had suggested that when those things took place, that the Christians should run for the hills, and they had done just that when Rome had attacked, and it's probably what saved the beginnings of the early church. They had run to the hills, to another city when Rome had attacked. But there are other things in this passage that clearly have not taken place, as Luke writes them. The things about the coming of the kingdom of God, about Jesus' return, about how the heaven and the earth and the whole universe will respond to this amazing new thing that God is about to do. Jesus says that at such times, even though these words sound a little frightening to us, we should not be afraid. We should stand up straight and lift our eyes to heaven, because this is good news. Our redemption is coming. The kingdom of God is coming. And he compares it to a fig tree, or to all of the trees as they begin to bud in the spring. And he says, you know that when the trees begin to bud, that summer is coming, and summer is good. Summer is warm, and summer is a time when things are fruitful and there's food on the trees. Now you notice, he doesn't say that the coming of the kingdom is like the autumn, when the leaves are falling and telling us that we're getting ready for winter and cold and snow and ice. Boo-hoo. He doesn't say that. He says that the coming of the kingdom of God is like the coming of spring and summer and all things alive and full of fruit and good food and good things. He says to us that we as Christian people should not be discouraged and downcast. We should be strong and faithful and hopeful, because we have been invited to the best party ever. We've been invited to the kingdom of God, where we will stand in the presence of God. So on this first Sunday of Advent, I want to invite you to hope. I want to invite you to look for the good things that God is doing among us. Look for the good. And I know that that's a challenge in our culture, where we have just made a thing out of looking at bad things and complaining and griping about things. It's just kind of part of our culture to focus on what's wrong with the world. I want to invite you to look for what's right, and look for what's good, and look for what God is doing among us. So we do from time to time, right? We look back in the church to the glory days, and we say, oh, remember those days when all the pews were full and the Sunday school classrooms were bursting at the seams, and we feel sad because, we're not in that place, not quite in that place anymore. But instead, perhaps we need to look at the children that are ours today, at the young people that are ours today, and aren't they lovely? And what a blessing it is to be able to do ministry with them and for them, and to look at the people who sit around us in the pews, our family and friends, and to be grateful that we have companions on the journey of faith together. We can look for the good. And it's possible that, we may choose to look at the 55% of LaPorte County residents who are struggling to make ends meet, who don't have basic needs in their families. We can look at that. It's of deep concern for us. But should we not also look at ministries of compassion like the Salvation Army, with whom we collaborate, who are working so hard to provide services and help for those underprivileged families and to get them back on their feet? We need to lift up their ministries and look at the ways that we can collaborate with them and give thanks for that. We need to look at the good. And we can talk about hurricanes and fires and natural disasters and wars and famines, because there's plenty of that in our world. We can talk about that and think about that and hopefully pray about that. But let's also talk about Presbyterian Disaster Assistance and their work, as they have just recently sent national response teams to California to help those presbyteries who are dealing with the effects of the fire, who not long ago sent response teams to the presbyteries working to alleviate suffering from Hurricane Michael. And the one that I'm most impressed with is the response teams who are in Bangladesh working with Rohingya refugees, 6,600 Rohingya refugees, and providing food and shelter and sanitation and psychological and spiritual counseling. What a wonderful thing that's happening. We can look for the good. I know that every one of us has in our personal lives something that we wish were different. And we wish we're somehow better, whether it is a financial stressor, whether it's a job that just isn't quite going well, or whether we have a family member that's in trouble, and we are concerned about those things. But friends, we have roofs over our heads. I know you do. We have food in our bellies. We have people in our lives that we love, that we care for, and people in our lives who love and care for us. The sun came up this morning and it was glorious. Did you see it? The sun came up. It was beautiful this morning. And we opened our eyes and we breathed in the breath of God. We can look for the good. God hasn't abandoned us. God has called us and given us to the world. We are called to be people of hope, people who have hope, who give hope, who make hope happen. We are called to be those who look for the good and look for ways to involve ourselves in the good. We've learned that from the saints of the church, people like Jack Beck, people like Jean Burroughs, who we also relinquished to the Lord this year. Gosh, Jean was another one of those people who just always was looking for the good and looking for a way to get involved with things that were good. Jean sat in our pews a little over a year ago when someone made an announcement about how we needed help putting up the Christmas tree this year. And Jean, who at the time I think was using a walker and kind of half blind, leaned over to his wife and said, "Would you remind me of that date because I want to come down and help?" Jean was one of those who looked for the good and looked for all of the ways that he could be involved in the good. On this first day of Advent, decide that you are going to be one of those people who looks for what God is doing in our world, who looks for the good things that God is about, and decide that you're going to be one of those people who gets involved with one of those good things of God and makes hope happen.